Morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome everyone, wherever you are in the world, to today's webinar. My name is John Field and I am one of two vice chairs for the IOSH Fire Risk Management Group. It is my pleasure to introduce you to Daniel Pyatt, who will be leading the webinar today. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please put these in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We will endeavour to answer as many as possible at the end of today's session. However, if we do not get enough time to answer them, then please be assured that we will be downloading all the questions after the webinar, and we will respond to all of them and we'll place them on the website along with a copy, a recording of the webinar itself. And as I say, a recording of the webinar and a copy of the slides will be available after the session. There is no CPD certificate issued, but you can use the slides and recording within your Blueprint record. Now, before I hand you over to our speaker this afternoon, I'd like to mention our conference taking place on the 19th of September at Informa Markets in London. Full details can be found on our linked page, our IOSH website event page, and by scanning the QR code on your screen now. Don't worry, if you don't get time to do it now, we will be advertising this conference on LinkedIn as well. So back to today's webinar and our presenter, Daniel. Daniel has worked in the fire sector for over 10 years. He has previously worked in public sector prisons, regulatory fire safety and consultancy. He currently works in the higher education sector as a fire safety operations manager, where he is responsible for day-to-day operational fire safety delivery and also strategic operational fire safety planning. In terms of PEEPs, he has been involved in reviewing PEEP process, reviewing pre-existing PEEPs, and carrying out new PEEP assessments. And it is now my pleasure to hand over to Daniel. Thank you, Daniel.
Hi, everybody, and thank you, John, for the introduction. We're just going to load up the slides in a moment. Brilliant. So today we're going to be looking at supporting people who require assistance to evacuate. So in the UK, the general population is around 67 million people. Of the 67 million people, 51 million people are recorded as having no disability, and 16 million people are registered as having a disability. In the employment sense, of the 67 million people, 25.7 million people are of non-working age, and working age is around 41 million. And of that, there's 25 million people with an impairment and over 4 million people with a disability. So you'll see the numbers there with impairments and having a disability, the low numbers of having a disability, and we'll just explain that a bit later in the slides. So when considering the impacts of providing assistance and carrying out PEEPs, we can look at the 3-tier moral, legal and financial means of why it's important. Now, morally, it goes without saying that, morally speaking, the principles that guide human conduct and behaviours, we would do everything we can to make sure that our buildings are safe, that people can get out of the buildings in the event of an emergency. Then we look at the legal. So we have our criminal liabilities, breach of duties under various pieces of legislation. And then you've got the civil repercussions. If it's within the workplace, it could be an employment tribunal, or in civil courts, things like injury claims. And then we consider the financial impact. So the direct impact could be things like employee sick pay if they're unable to return to work. And I've recently actually been through a situation where a member of staff is unable to return to work because of provisions that aren't currently available. And that's taken a lot of time and a lot of people's time and effort to actually try and put this in place. And if that was already in place as a matter of cause, then there would have been a huge saving to the employer, but also to the employee who's struggling to deal with the fact that she can't actually come back to work at the moment. Then you got things like overtime related to staff. So if you can't return the member of staff back to work, you may have to employ agency staff. Loss of production. If the member of staff's an experienced member of your team, all their knowledge and experience is going to be, unfortunately, sitting at home with them and not in the office where it should be. So I'm going to look a bit more into the legal impacts of this. Apologies. So the first piece of legislation we have is the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order 2005. And in Article 14, subsection 2B, it states that in the event of danger, it must be possible for persons to evacuate the premises as quickly and as safely as possible. And if you note, there's a must in there, so it's an absolute requirement. And then when we look at Article 15, the responsible person, again, must establish and, where necessary, give effect to appropriate procedures, including safety drills to be followed in the event of serious imminent danger. So again, it's about having good, clear policies and procedures in place to ensure that people can evacuate the building in the event of emergency. But then when we think about some of the things that we might need to implement in procedures, so things like using evacuation chairs, for example, Article 15B then goes on to say that not to nominate a sufficient number of competent persons to implement those procedures. So there's no point spending money on buying an evacuation chair if you're not going to actually train people to use them. Apologies. Then we've got the Equality Act. And the Equality Act, one thing that a lot of people misunderstand with the Equality Act is that they talk about people with disabilities, that someone having a condition is automatically disabled. And actually under the Equality Act, under Article 6, it actually clearly defines the difference between which basically states what is the legal definition of disability. So what it says is that a person has a disability if they have a physical or mental impairment, and the impairment has a substantial and long-term adverse effect on their ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. So it's important to understand that the person may have a physical or mental impairment. The key thing is that that impairment has a substantial and long-term adverse effect on their ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. That's why in the earlier slides, the disparity on numbers for people who were disabled in employment was only around 4 million, as opposed to people with impairments, which was around 25 million. So now let's assume that our employee or has a disability as defined by the Equality Act. That then engages the duty to make reasonable adjustments. But the key word there is reasonable. And obviously what is reasonable depends on the type of environment you're in. If you're in a small office, quite a small business, then what's reasonable is going to be slightly less than, say, for example, if you worked in higher education, in a university with lots of money and lots of buildings and lots of staff available to assist. Then we've got the Health and Safety at Work Act under Article 2, which requires every employer to ensure, as far as reasonably practical, the health and safety welfare of all its employees. And then we have a duty that's also implied onto self-employed persons, as it is the employee. Then we have the Management of Health and Safety at Work Regulations 1999. And for those of you who are new to the fire industry, the the fire safety order is actually taken broadly from the Management of Health and Safety at Work Regulations. So when you read them side by side, you'll see quite a few similarities in what they talk about. So under Article 8 of the Management of Health and Safety at Work Act, it says that every employer shall establish and when necessary give effect to appropriate procedures to be followed in the event of serious and imminent danger. And when we compare that to the fire safety order, that is an Article 15 requirement. And again, under Article 1 of the Management of Health and Safety at Work Regulations, 1B, again, it talks about nominating sufficient numbers of competent persons to implement the procedures. So both the fire safety order and the Management of Health and Safety at Work regulations require that a suitable and sufficient fire risk assessment be made, either it be a fire risk assessment or health and safety assessment. And both pieces of legislation require that you specifically note any groups of people specifically at risk. So having looked at the legal implications of why it's important, I think what's important is that we look at the types of impairments that actually some people don't consider to be impacting on people's ability to evacuate in the event of fire, or in fact, in any situation. It could be that you've got an issue in the building that requires to evacuate, but it's not a fire issue. So when we look here at the impairments, so we've got four broad impairments that we look at when we consider people's ability to self-evacuate. So the first one is mobility. Examples of this could be a person in a wheelchair. Could be that someone's using crutches. Someone with an underlying health condition such as asthma or a heart condition. Or something that's commonly overlooked is someone who's pregnant. Especially at the later stages of pregnant, there could be mobility which results mobility reduction, which means that they're going to be slower at evacuating the building than they would have in the early stages of the pregnancy. Also, what's important to understand is that we need to look at not just the permanent impairment. So we also need to look at, well, what happens if someone comes in on Monday with a broken leg with crutches? Yes, they may only need it for 6 months, but they're just as important to consider under this process as someone who is in a wheelchair with a long-term condition. So thinking practically, how can we put things in place to support people who have a mobility issue? So we've got an example here. So here is a refuge point. If you've been in public buildings or any building you may have seen these type of refuge points. And in effect, what happens is that someone on the upper floors would come into the area where the refuge is. They would press the button. That would then notify a control panel on the ground floor of the building, generally next to the fire panel or in the security control room. And they would let the person know that they're there. And once the investigation period has taken place to ensure that it's not a false alarm, then action will be taken to assist them leave the building. One thing to consider, though, is if you've got these in your workplace, there is a standard that talks about background noise and the ability for people to actually hear the outstation. You'll be surprised how many buildings I've visited in the past where the outstation on the upper floor is actually directly above a sounder, for example. And if the sound is too loud, you're not going to be able to speak to the person on the end of the phone. Then we've got things like evacuation aids. So it may be an evacuation chair or an evacuation sheet. But it's important that if you provide these items, that you ensure that you have staff trained to use them. In my time in fire safety, I've inspected many care homes, and you'd be surprised that when you ask the questions about their staffing and about the training to support the evacuation of people that are, for example, bedbound using evacuation sheets, that actually in the day, yes, they have a large amount of staff to facilitate this. But then as soon as you ask about the nighttime facilities, we find very quickly that the staff numbers are reduced, which means the number of people that are trained and competent in the use of these devices is actually very, very low or non-existent. So then we look at a visual impairment. So it could be that someone is fully blind, they just can't see. It may be that they're partially sighted. So what's the impact of this? So they may be unable to navigate their escape routes. They may be unable to see obstacles in the escape routes. And again, that's why it's really important that we keep our escape routes clear. They may also be slower to evacuate. And again, to give you an example of a visually impaired person that I've come across, I once did a review on a PEEP where the person was living in a residence within a university back setting. They'd placed the person on the upper floors in a room that was at the furthest point of the escape corridor. And the route actually came when they got to the door of the flats, which are cluster flats. To open the door, you only had a small turn thumb key. So I went through that PEEP with the responsible person or the person acting on behalf of them. And we talked through things like, you know, it's going to take longer for someone with a visual impairment to go from A to B. So let's make sure that the route and the distance between their flat and the outside is at the closest point possible. So let's put them on the lowest floor we can, which was then the first floor. And then let's put them right next to the door so they don't have to walk too far to the door. And also let's change the thumb lock. Let's give it a decent lock or put it on a system that allows the door to open without having to use a thumb lock. So how can we support people with visual impairments? So things like alternative formats. So if you've got a fire action notice, you can provide a copy of the notice in Braille. You may wish to consider audio taping the fire action notice, or also providing a helper or a buddy to read through the notice as and when the person requires the assistance. Then you've got items such as orientation information. So you've got tactical plans, which are basically plans with a raised piece so that people can then run their hands across them and then work out their escape routes. And then we look at things like hearing impairment. So it could be, they might just be deaf. So it might be a full hearing loss. It might be a partial hearing loss. It might be a temporary impairment that means that actually in 6 to 12 months, they may be fine. But what's important is that the likelihood of them becoming aware of the fire alarm may be reduced significantly. So how can we best support people with hearing impairments? So here's an example here of what's called a visual alert device. So these devices could be standalone. They're usually red on the wall. And when the fire alarm goes, the red beacon will flash. The one in this image is actually a combined visual aid with, you can have the visual aid with a blank plate, which will just flash. You can add a smoke detector to this device, or you can add a sounder to this device, or you can add all three. So you can have a visual alarm, audio alarm, and a heat or smoke detector attached to this. Then you've got things like paging alert systems. So these paging alert systems, when the fire alarm goes, it will send a message to a pager with a preset text, generally something along the lines of fire in building 1. Then the person will look at the pager, and if they're in building 1, then they'll escape, assuming that they've got no other complications within their requirements. You can also have on these things like vibrating pillows and other devices to, again, to support people at night, for example. And then finally, we've got cognitive impairment. So things like dyslexia, autism, or people with learning disabilities. This can be impacted by their comprehension of being able to read or write. In some cases, it might be their comprehension of risk. Also, it could be a reluctancy to follow unfamiliar routes. So if they're used to traveling in a particular route every day of the week, they may not actually be happy to travel an alternative, even if it is the closest exit. So in terms of cognitive impairments, one good support mechanism is a buddy system. You might have more than one buddy depending on their availability, what days of the week they come in. It may be that your buddy can offer specialist support that the other buddy can't. But what's important with a buddy system is that we always make sure that there is someone there for them. We don't forget that when their buddy goes on leave, that there's actually then no one there to support them. Alternative exits. You'd be surprised how many people don't walk their alternative exits. I'm one of the kind of people that if I go to a hotel, I'll always walk the alternative exits because it's important to realize, that in some cases, an alternative may actually be closer than the main exit. And also on occasions where the building owner has also neglected the alternative exit, it's a good opportunity to raise these concerns. So then we go into looking at the PEEP assessment. Now, my experience in the PEEP process is that a lot of people don't follow a clear process. A clear process will help identify issues and actually speaking to the person that needs the assistance. I did a mass review recently on a group of PEEPs. And the process was that they would do it on a more desktop basis. So they would basically ask a question. If it wasn't in the question paper, then the question was never asked. And whatever they put on the paper was then predefined through a matrix system. So I said to the relevant persons, you need to bring these people in and have a chat with them. Sometimes when you've got simple impairments, so for example, if someone has a hearing impairment and that's the only impairment they have, then yes, issuing something like a deaf pager may be appropriate. But it was only through these assessment processes that we're actually able to find out that when these people were having their bad days, they weren't able to do anything. And if they were in a residential building, for example, like the student accommodation, it meant that on a bad day, they wouldn't be able to self-evacuate. But because the process didn't allow that through the question and answer paper, it meant it was a really key piece of information that was missed. So the advice from me is to ensure that you discuss the person's individual needs, understand what a good day looks like, and understand what a bad day looks like. Also, check the area of work. Walk the routes, check the areas. You'll be surprised that actually on occasions I've walked routes and found staircases or doors that are locked. And in practice, that's not really helpful. It's important to practice the PEEP. So walk through the PEEP, or when you do fire drills, for example, you might want to get someone to actually watch what happens to see whether the PEEP actually works. And again, it's also important to review it. There's no point doing a PEEP and then leaving it for 6, 12, 18 months and never reviewing it, because it might be that their situation changes. It may get worse. So then we've got JEEPs, or generic emergency evacuation plans. So here's an example here of a JEEP. And it's commonly found on the back of a hotel room. Actually, this is where I got this example from. And it's very, very, very simple. It shows you the escape routes. It shows you where the rooms are in comparison to where you are to help you basically understand where you are. It identifies where the refuge points are. And at the bottom of the evacuation plan, it's got a very, very simple evacuation plan written on the document. Again, these don't need to be complicated. They can be as simple as they need to be to achieve the objective, which is to ensure that the person in your building is able to safely evacuate in the event of fire. Other Jeeps, things like people in wheelchairs, if the ability to mobilize is the only issue, then a Jeep could be quite simply that the person is in a wheelchair, the only issue they have is a mobility issue, and therefore they could use the refuge points within a building. So we have covered a handful of different things. We've covered things like the legislation, and we've also covered hopefully some practical elements to supporting people to assist them in event of an emergency. And that's all from me.
Thank you, Daniel. Caught me unawares. I was trying to answer some questions there, but thank you very much for that informative session. We do have some questions, and whilst you've been talking, people have been answering the questions for us as well, so we can discuss them.
Thank you.
See if you've got any further points. But please do remember, if we don't get to answer all the questions right now, we will be answering the questions after the session. So in the chat, we did have a question: what is the standard for noise levels in refuge points? That come from Sean Anderson, I believe it is. And Dave Wright and Anne Isaacs, my fellow vice chair, both answered British Standard 5839 Part 9. Would you have anything further to answer to that, Daniel? Is there a specific volume level or anything like that at all?
So 5839 Part 9, it's paragraph 11.6, subsection K, and it talks about the background noise, that it should be not more than 50 decibels or a shield around the outstation. So that's the guidance that is available in that standard, last revised in 2021.
Okay, nice one. Thank you for clarifying that, Daniel. A consideration for all of us, I think, personally, in the world of hybrid working, the question is, how effective is a buddy system? And I guess really it's all to do with reasonable adjustment and making sure people there's sufficient people to carry out the PEEP. But could you maybe go into a bit more detail with regards to that aspect, Daniel?
Sure. So I think hybrid working it comes with its benefits and unfortunately its drawbacks. And one of its big drawbacks is obviously having enough people on site to be able to deliver these PEEPs through the buddy systems. And although we're not really talking about it now, but things like fire marshals, for example, it really comes down to looking at your risk assessment and trying to understand in reality what can we do and what can't we do. If the person is classed as having a disability, then obviously that then engages the duty to make reasonable adjustments. So it may be that you consider things like home working on the days that you can't provide a buddy. So yeah.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. We do still have some in the chat, but we do have some in the Q&A section. So one question: if a guest that arrives doesn't mention their disability, and obviously they arrive, and lo and behold, they have some kind of impairment, what responsibilities does the person have?
Good question. Ultimately, they need to ensure that they take, practicable steps to ensure that they provide a safe environment for this person. Unfortunately, there will always be cases in very unique circumstances where it's unfortunate that you won't be able to provide the service that is being offered. And that's a difficult decision to make. But ultimately, if you're providing a service and that service is to provide, for example, a hotel room on the 3rd floor of a building, but you know full well that if they go up there, there's no way of being able to get them out, then you'd be, negligent in your duty to safeguard the person. But yeah, I mean, it is a difficult one to address, and I've seen it many times. Had the phone call where someone's called me and said, we've got a person in a wheelchair and actually the lift's out of service. What do we do? Or the evacuation chair, we haven't got the people trained today because we didn't expect people to be here. You do the best you can, but making sure that you don't put them in harm's way.
And I guess as long as you take as many steps as possible to explain to the person before they arrive, when they do the booking, that you need to be aware of any disabilities, then you are showing due diligence and doing what you can, I guess.
Exactly. And I think that's another key process that people miss is about giving people the opportunity to declare any impairments or any concerns before the event or before say attending the hotel, for example. So it's important to implement them as part of your normal procedures. Make sure there's something on your website or in your information or in your pre-booking information, your terms and conditions, to make sure that people have the opportunity to declare, so they don't just turn up, and then you're put on the spot and you're not entirely sure what to do.
No problem, thank you. Maggie has asked, as she works north of the border in the Highlands, is there any additional legislation that applies from the Scottish Government? Would we know?
Unfortunately, I wouldn't be able to tell you, but it is definitely a question we can take away and come back to you on.
Nice one, definitely. So Ian has asked, in a high-rise office, are you still required to provide evac chairs if a fire-protected lift is available? Training in the use is more difficult, with reluctance from employees to be trained, and also reluctance of disabled people to use an evac chair. What would you say?
I mean, sorry, John, apologies there.
No,
ultimately, I mean, there's one thing to provide something, for example, like an evac chair or an evacuation lift, but you need to be practical in terms of, well, even if I provide this, are people going to use it? But then ultimately, if you don't provide something, then the question will be, have you taken reasonable steps? And the answer will probably be no, because yes, the person may be reluctant in the early stages of conversation. And again, I've had it where I've said, I've gone through the process of a PEEP and I said, right, one of the things that I'm going to propose is the use of an evac chair. Have you used an evac chair before? Do you know what they're about? Are you happy to go in an evac chair? And some people have said, I'm not happy. And I've said, okay, well, let's go. Are you happy if I give you some training about understanding how they're used, why they're used? Then I'll get someone to do a demonstration with one of our trainers. And actually, once you walk and talk through the processes and reassure them that what's in place is safe for them, generally people will come on board with the idea. But that then again goes back to the previous statements around, what happens if they just refuse, because they might just say, I'm not interested. Well, then the question comes down to, can you show that you're diligent in what you're doing? And there may be cases where you turn around and say, I'm sorry, but if you're not going to work with us to provide you the support you need to keep you safe, you'll need to explore other avenues.
Something that we consider in my organisation where I work, the fact that the person has to be able to get themselves into the evac chair is one factor. And also, in order to install an evacuation lift or firefighting lift, you have to have two separate power sources. So there obviously can be those costs involved, and a reasonable adjustment then has to go down that route of, well, is this cost effective, etc. But it's, yeah, definitely something to ponder, obviously. Let's have a look. Someone has, so Chris has asked, if you have an employee who suffers from seizures, would an evac mat be mandatory? Does it depend on how well the seizures are managed? The employer can make a judgment call to whether the equipment is required or not. Some people may have it well controlled and haven't had seizure a long time, and tend to only happen at specific times of day. So if something's sort of a sporadic occurrence or might not have happened some time, would you suggest that it's still considered as an impairment and measures put in place just in case?
So generally, someone with epilepsy would be considered disabled. It's a good question again. Ultimately, this comes down to the review process. You know, what is current today and what is relevant support today may not be relevant support tomorrow. So, for example, if someone declares their disability and says, right, I've got epilepsy, and you go through a process of asking the right questions, you know, when was the last seizure? Is it well controlled? Is there anything, what causes your seizures? So some people might have seizures caused by loud noises. So, for example, it might be the fire alarm actually causes them to have a seizure. And if that process then shows that actually today they can self-evacuate, brilliant. But then put a review process in place. You know, get support from occupational health if you've got an occupational health provider. I mean, it's important just to make sure that you're constantly reviewing and engaging with the person in question to make sure that they feel supported and you feel that you're discharging your duties.
We have Craig has commented on the fact that he understood that firefighting lifts, in whatever format they are, it's only just recently I appreciated that there's all different types, and they're called all different things as well. But anyway, he understood that firefighting lifts were only to be used by the fire and rescue service. What are your views on that?
So obviously you've got firefighting lifts, and then we've got evacuation lifts. Again, you know, it's one of those things of the lift. If you can be trained to use the lift and you can use the lift effectively, then maybe. But you know, are there other alternatives? You know, it's important not to dismiss things straight off the fact that, you know, just because it's a firefighting lift, don't use it. But it shouldn't. I would suggest it shouldn't be your first port of call. Yeah, I mean, have you got any views from John? Do you want to share any?
Yeah, so in my organisation, ultimately, like you've just said, if it's in place, I always refer and default to a court of law. If you're in front of the judge and a person perished, they had an impairment, and the only way out in essence for them was the firefighting lift, and you didn't use it, I would suggest the judge would question why. Have you not been trained? Do you not know how to use it? If it's in place, it's there, then use it. The fire service don't turn up immediately anyway, because there's some time for the call to go through in whatever format that might be. It has to get to the station. They have to get ready. They have to get on the fire engines and then come out. In that time, certain buildings within my organisation, the staff have been trained to use the firefighting lift because security don't use it. They use the stairs, and then the building occupiers use this lift to pick the people up on each floor, bring them down, and evacuate them safely. It's in place. They've had the training, and they have to bear in mind the moment the fire service turn up, they then take priority of that lift. So I would suggest if something's in place and it can be used, then I would suggest there would be questions asked if you didn't. Would you agree with that, perhaps?
Absolutely.
Excellent. Right, we've got lots and lots of questions, and they all keep coming in. Okay, so Camaro has a small boutique hotel. Is it mandatory to have evac chairs in the building, or is it a recommendation?
Good question. I think the question comes back to well, what can you do if you book someone into your hotel with an impairment or such as a mobility concern? How are you going to ensure that you've taken every reasonable step to evacuate them from the building? You know, there's very few, especially once buildings are built, must-dos. You know, everything comes down to, you know, is it reasonable? Is it sensible? Could you have done more? I think that's the key message for today as well, is could I have done anything more, or could I have changed anything to make the situation, the outcome differently? Because, you know, I think another thing as well is that, and I think there was some case law on this actually, that basically says, you know, people can't. So for example, if someone comes to your building and says, oh, I want to go into your building, so I'm really sorry, but you know, our evacuation lift's offline, there's no evac chairs, the trainers aren't here. They can't then turn around and go, don't worry about it, I'll sort myself out, for example. So that's not an acceptable argument to say, well, I explained everything to them and they said, I'm happy to take the risk. That's not an argument now that people can have. So, you know, again, you need to make sure you do everything that is reasonable in the circumstances to safeguard people's welfare, you know, and yeah, I think that's basically where you're at.
Definitely, I totally agree. And obviously, under the Equalities Act, if you provide a service as far as you can, you have to provide that service for all. You cannot discriminate unless, of course, there's certain aspects which I would suggest would prevent you from offering that service. It could be a really old building where there's no way of installing any kind of lift, etc., where there would be nothing stopping you from adapting the ground floor rooms, etc. But yes, you can't leave the person to deal with themselves. I totally agree there, buddy.
And I think just one more thing to add to that, John.
Go for it.
It's on that basis of considering everything, you know, don't just say, well, actually, I can't do it. Do feasibilities on it. I always say to people, carry out a feasibility, get someone in, get a quote, have a discussion, and then you've been able to evidence that actually, you know, I've looked at putting in this provision and actually they quoted me £100,000 for it. And actually, you know, I don't even make £20,000 a year on a turnover. You know, that's going to be 5 years of my profit just to put that in, and the business isn't sustainable, for example. So it's really important that you do these feasibilities. You know, and I always ask that when we do things like buildings and we consider sprinklers, you know, I always say to the designers and the, you know, yes, I hear that it probably doesn't need them, but can you make sure that you've considered them in the process? Make sure you've looked at a cost, looked at the provision, and that you've taking it out based on some really clear data, as opposed to, well, I think that it's just not going to work.
Definitely. No, you're showing due diligence, and yeah, no, you could stand up in a court as I default to, and then prove actually I've you know taken every step I can, but it's not possible, or it is possible, and this is what I've done. Is there any due diligence in regards to PEEP's requirement in a working from home setting?
Yeah, it's not the first time I've had the question. Well, I would suggest no. although I'm not a barrister, and ultimately it's the judge's decision. But you know, there's a lot of questions that come around the health and safety of people at home with the hybrid working aspect to it. I don't know much about that element when it comes to home working, but when we take the legislation, for example, if we look at, for example, the fire safety order, obviously it doesn't apply to a single private dwelling. So if it's someone's house, their home, then the fire safety order doesn't apply. If we look at the Equality Act, again, could they argue that? Again, I don't think it's likely, especially if they're in their own home. And ultimately, you know, if they're in their own home and you don't feel that they're safe, then ask them to come into work. Yeah, it's a difficult question to answer, I think. You know, John may be able to add something to this.
It is obviously being identified where if someone's allowed to work from home, then in essence that does constitute a place of work. So we are covered under the Health and Safety at Work, etc. Act, obviously. But like you say, yes, if that's someone's private dwelling, how do they get about the space anyway if they live there? So I would assume that there's measures in place for them to get about because they live there, so they should be able to utilize those aspects. But perhaps we can see if we can find any more guidance on that for after. Not a problem. Very good question. So here's a question, and I've kind of formulated some kind of element in my head. What if you have more than one person requiring the use of an evacuation chair?
Depends. Generally, a fire only happens in one area. Again, you'd have to look at your building, look at the way it's designed, speak to your risk assessor. Because I have this question come up every time I do training for evac chair training. Generally speaking, if someone has a PEEP and they work in roughly the same area, you know where they are. You know that you've got an evacuation chair that can then support them in that area. If you then get a second person that needs an evacuation chair and they work in the same area, then the question is, well, do I have for example, the staircase, for example, do I have a protected area where I can put these people that I can guarantee a level of safety, and then actually I can go up and take them down one at a time? It might be that actually you do need more than one chair. You know, the thing with this subject, it's very fact specific because no one comes with the same underlying impairments. Some people's impairments change day to day, hour to hour. So there's no one simple answer to that question. But the only other example I'll give, for example, I've got a building where I work now and they have an east and west. So if I had one chair to cover the whole building and I had someone in the east and someone in the west, I'd be reasonably happy that if there's a fire in the east or the west, they can go into the alternative side of the building and prolong their level of safety. You know, it's a bit like the principles of progressive horizontal evacuation in hospitals. You know, if you can ensure that by moving compartments that it provides an extra level of safety, then utilize that process for people with PEEPs. You know, but what's important is though that is you know how your building's designed. Again, from a consultancy point of view, I've been in many buildings where people assume their compartmentation lines exist. And actually, when you have a good dig around, you find that the hole the size of a football is actually stuck with newspaper. So the compartmentation is actually of, you know, it's just not existing.
I think that's key. You understand the fire strategy of the building, the fire compartmentation, exactly as you said, perhaps getting the person to a place of relative safety would allow one person to be evacuated, then perhaps the next. We do seem to feed off this need. The minute the fire alarm goes off, we have to evacuate. When I was a lifeguard, we would get people out the swimming pool and have them stood by the exits. We wouldn't necessarily get them out because they could be cold. Same with sheltered accommodation. We had a fire in the building, but because it is dark, cold, inclement weather, as a fire service, we kept people in the sort of social area rather than having to evacuate them, because they're in a place of safety. We were nearby as well. And ultimately, the incident was actually happening on the roof several floors above. So I think it is a consideration of what is your fire strategy, where are the fire compartments, exactly as you said, and making sure that they are fire compartments, then you can consider your evacuation strategy accordingly with that. Totally agree. We've got a question here from Chris. The use of evacuation mats for those in moulded wheelchairs or motorised wheelchairs. Can the PEEP state rescue by fire service from the refuge point and only use the evac mat as a last result via a best interest decision?
I think it is clearly noted that actually the fire and rescue service aren't the first port of call for your evacuation process. That's not to say that they won't assist or won't carry out the evacuation. However, if your strategy is purely based on the fact that you're going to rely on the fire service to evacuate your people, I think you're not going to be able to evidence the fact that you're managing fire safety in your organisation effectively. You know, it's fine in metropolitan areas. I mean, if I call 999 in London, generally I get a fire engine within kind of 8 minutes. But, you know, I've been to places where they're like, oh, you know, they'll be here in 15 minutes. That's if they're not busy. They might be a little bit longer. You know, you can't rely on the fire and rescue service to be your evacuation process or your procedure. It needs to be led by you, it needs to be managed by you, and you need to do everything you can to make it happen.
Nice one, thank you, Daniel. Time is running out, but we have enough for maybe a couple more. One comment, a massive help that Sean's the name actually, oh yeah, Sean, identified that installing grab rails in the refuge point where evac chair transfer would take place would greatly support the ability of some people to self-transfer. I think that's a fantastic idea.
Yep, sounds sensible. And again, you know, it would have been through clear process of assessing and thinking and getting the input from people that require this support and understanding their needs. So I think that's a really good one. That's really good.
Definitely. Are firefighters trained? This is from Nathan. Are firefighters trained to use firefighting lifts?
Oh, there's a question. I mean, I've never been a firefighter, so I wouldn't want to speak out of turn. John, I believe you have a fire service background.
Indeed. So the Fire Services Act does stipulate that a fire service itself or the fire authority has to know the risks on its station ground. And by knowing your risk, you attend those venues, you take information about those venues, and then actually you practice drill. And if it's identified that there's a firefighting lift, because as I've said, there's different types of firefighting lift, generally they're all controlled in the same fashion, just like similar to evac lifts. And ultimately you practice utilizing these facilities, stop a couple of floors below the floor where you believe the fire is, progress up the stairs, go and investigate, and then not until you've got all the equipment in place do you then proceed to the bridgehead, which is 2 floors below. But in essence, yes, firefighters do train, and it's their duty to attend these venues with these facilities and practice using them.
I think there's another thing just to add here, John.
Go for it.
Obviously, you can invite the fire and rescue service into your organisation to do a visit. So if you've got someone that you know relies on an evacuation lift, for example, You know, you can always invite the fire and rescue service to come down and say, you know, do you guys know that we've got an evacuation lift here? You know, do you want to use it and have a go on it, and you know, make sure that you're familiar with it? You know, so that's another option as well, to ensure that crews are aware of that.
Definitely, and there's nothing better than, and the fire service, your local fire station, local fire crews would greatly appreciate being invited to site rather than having to organise attending. It might be that they're not overly familiar with what you have on your site. Maybe that they visited a few years before and it's since changed hands. And ultimately, the quicker they can get in, the more familiar they are with your buildings, and the quicker they can address the situation, if the fire service are called, of course, then the better that is for you and ultimately your business. So I would fully encourage people identifying your business with the fire service and inviting them down. We did have one about a GEEP. Here we go. Can you confirm that a GEEP is suitable for wheelchair users where you may have several wheelchair users present at different times?
So generally speaking, I would suggest that if you've got a high amount of people requiring certain amounts of assistance, that you would potentially have an idea that this was going to happen. Again, your GEEP process, you can monitor that process. So for example, even though you've got your floor plans, you can still have a GEEP process that monitors. For example, you know, if you come into a building, you can issue the GEEP to somebody and keep a record of that, so you know that you have a person in there on that day with a wheelchair evacuation need. If it's an employee, you would have already done your assessment, so you'd have known that yes, they're having a GEEP, but you would know the days that they're in work, where they'll be working, and so forth. Does that answer it, do you think, John?
Indeed, I think really, if you have a large number and they're anticipated, then you would have to put measures in place. If not, then you'd have to put measures in place on the day to restrict the numbers to a level that you could manage, because again, you can't put these people in danger. Well, ultimately, we've come to that time. So I'd like to thank Daniel for today's webinar, very informative. I'd like to thank everyone for coming along and all your questions. That's greatly appreciated. I must also not forget Amir, who's just put up a webinar feedback form and has been in the background making sure this has run smoothly, working on the technical aspects of things. So thank you everyone for attending. We will answer all the questions. As I say, we'll download them, or Amir will do all the hard work, and we'll answer your questions in due course. So hope to see you at future webinars. Thank you very much to everybody, and goodbye.
Thanks everyone, take care.